Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On July 26th, the democratically elected government of Niger was ousted in a military coup, and its president was placed under house arrest. As international demands to release President Bazoum have been ignored, the airspace of Niger has been closed, and the threat of military intervention remains. Will President Bazoum ever be returned to power? Will the surrounding nations actually carry out their threat of military intervention? And what are the implications of this for the Africa Sahel region, the United States, and the global balance of power? The crisis in Niger, next. Stephanie Savell is the senior researcher for the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and co director of the Costs of War Project. A writer of numerous articles on global terrorism, her work has appeared in publications such as The Guardian, Axios, Responsible Statecraft, and Foreign Policy. She is co author of the book The Civic Imagination Making a Difference in American Public Life. Dr. Savell, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Let me ask you this. You were just in Niger in January,
Mm.
and several months ago, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken called Niger a model of democracy. But yet, when you were there, you saw something different. So, what is it that the Secretary missed or is reluctant to admit?
Yeah, there were a lot of signs that it was far from a model of democracy. In particular, there were two things that were really kind of red flags. The first was that almost I spoke with a lot of journalists and also, human rights movement activists and university students and things like that. It's always good to kind of, get the different political views. So I really sought out some of those folks. And but one, almost every single journalist and activist that I spoke with had been silenced in some way by the government. So everything from imprisonment and torture to legal cases that were held against a particular activist. So it really was a climate where if you had a kind of peaceful dissent and a peaceful opposing view of the government, there were many mechanisms at play to silence you. The other thing that I investigated was that there were what the government called states of emergency that they instituted in particular hotspots in the border regions of the country, a few different places, where several sources told me that there were extreme authoritarian measures in place. So, for example, if you were caught riding a motorcycle, motorcycles were banned. And if you were caught riding a motorcycle, government security forces were authorized to shoot at people riding motorcycles. Same thing if you were out past curfew. There was one region of the country where cultivating certain types of foodstuffs and fishing was actually outlawed because the government wanted to attack the base of the insurgent support. These are kind of counterinsurgency strategies, really. So this stuff was not being publicized, and certainly, not everyone was talking about it. But if you spoke with there were particular ethnic groups that were really bearing the brunt of these kinds of policies. The Fulani, which is traditionally a herding group that has practiced Islam for centuries, and also the Black Tuareg, which were, it's another nomadic group, and they were former slaves of this Tuareg group. So that's just a snapshot of some of also the ethnic and political tensions that are at stake in some of the policies. And there were particular groups of people who were really bearing the brunt of those kind of government crackdowns.
So, given that information that you just gave, what really led to the coup in of itself? Was it organic, or was there external being fomented externally, i.e., Russia or the Wagner Group? So,
Yeah,
what led to this coup?
yeah. So I don't think the Wagner Group had a role in, fomenting the coup. I really see the coup as being driven by internal factors. There were a lot of divisions within government, and the military had been plotting a coup for years, and President Bazoum, who's been in power for the past couple of years, was very aware of this. He had a lot of measures to kind of divide, and also kind of buy people out by giving them government positions. So there was a lot of kind of political maneuvering that was at play. And I think from what I've read, one of the main points of contention between the military and Bazoum's democratically elected government was the role of Western powers. So after neighboring Burkina Faso and Mali had military coups of their own, and there the juntas were really saying, there's a lot of insecurity. The democratically elected governments are not doing a good enough job solving this problem. We're going to do a better job. We need to take over government. And, popularly, there was a lot of support for that because people are so fed up with the conflict and the insecurity and seeing their governments as ineffective. So I think that the military within Niger saw it important to align with Burkina Faso and Mali and be a strong bloc. And whereas President Bazoum was kind of turning to the West for support with security and accepting hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. There were troops from France that were stationed there. That was a hugely unpopular move because there's just a lot of anti-colonial sentiment against the French. And there were, I think personal antagonisms at stake too. Again, some, ethnic antagonisms that I don't even begin to know the full extent of because they're very complex. They date from colonial and pre-colonial times. All of that is in the mix. So it's very complicated, but certainly there's precedent for coups in Niger. This is the fifth coup since independence in the 1960s.
Given all of that, and this is more perhaps of a philosophical question, can democracy really take place in a country like Niger when you have a situation where you have a democratically elected president, even though there were some issues with the election that many people talked about? But nonetheless, it was, for the most part, seen as a fair election. But then the military can just come in and say, we don't think this government is legitimate and take over. What does that say about the future of democracy in a place like whether it's Burkina Faso, Mali, and obviously Niger?
Oh, I wish I had an answer for you. I do believe that there's been polling. What I can tell you is that there has been polling in many African countries that shows that people are broadly in favor of democracy and supportive of democracy. I think when you bring in this really devastating situation in which there are these groups, militant groups that are affiliated with Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, and they're wreaking havoc on villages in the name of it's territorial control, but it's also honestly more akin to gang violence in a lot of senses because they're seeking enrichment, and there's a lot of talk of creating, these militant groups are creating smuggling corridors from the Sahel band and the Sahara Desert down to the coast of West Africa. So there's all kinds of things being smuggled, drugs and weapons, and also, this is a big migrant sending area. So there's been a lot of smuggling of people now that the European Union cracked down on the Sahara Desert region as a place where it really wanted to police the migrant sending process. So there's a lot of upheaval, insecurity, and that makes it very difficult for a democratically elected government to maintain its legitimacy and credibility. There have been studies by the UNDP that show that African countries with history of military involvement in government, and in which the military has a bigger role in political life, are more likely to have this ongoing pattern of recurring coups. So all of these factors are kind of stacked against democracy, but that doesn't mean that people don't want it and that it can't emerge. I think there's a lot here that's still being worked out as a legacy of colonialism,
Mhm.
to be honest. Like, this is the kind of roiling aftermath of that injustice, and there's a lot of that's being worked out as a result.
Now, while France obviously has a lot of animosity aimed at it by the population, you were also critical of what the United States does, not only in Niger, but in the Sahel region in of itself, because of its paradigm of militarization in its effort to create counterterrorism strategies. Say more about that.
Yeah, so what I've found in my research is that long before this problem of these Islamist militant terror attacks came to start in the region, and I'm talking here in the early days after the 9/11 attacks on the US, when the US was kind of launching its global war on terror, what President Bush called the global war on terror. The US military began training and funding militaries in the West African region to have this kind of war on terror mentality. And the idea was preemptive war. So, attack the roots of the terrorist threat before it would emerge. And the problem with that is that when this kind of Islamist militant attacks started happening in the region. And that was really when Mali was destabilized, starting when Mali was destabilized in 2012. And it was linked together with the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, which is connected through the desert, and also a lot of separatist movements in Mali that have been active for decades. The the Islamist militants were able to kind of take advantage of that destabilization and kind of grow. So what happened was local governments, I argue, had been funded with so much. The scale of military assistance that the US gives is far more than any other Western power, far more than Russia. The Wagner Group is small beans compared to the hundreds of millions in security assistance the US has sent. And so these governments were empowered to use this narrative and the funding and the institutional supports of the war on terror to fight their own wars on terror. And what happened? That government violence, which was carried out against it's particular ethnic groups. The Fulani, in particular, have borne the brunt of discriminatory government, killings and disappearances, and other kinds of ways of discriminating against the Fulani. And in Niger, I talked about the Black Tuareg as well. These are groups that are different from the majority ethnic groups that have held power since colonial times, and so there's a sense in which there's we hear talk about blowback. It's
Mhm.
retaliation. So one of the biggest reasons, over 70%, I think it is, that in UN studies have shown that recruits to these militant groups are joining the groups because they want to retaliate against government violence. And so the US, and all this money, all these weapons, all this training, and this war on terror narrative have really just intensified this counterproductive cycle of local government violence, and then people joining the groups to retaliate against the government for killing a friend or a family member, or just the injustice of that. And so it's really perpetuated this and intensified this cycle of violence.
So if you see this and in your research and you have witnessed this and you've written about this, one could suggest that the United States understands this as well and sees this. So why isn't there a shift in strategy in dealing with these countries? Is it simply because the United States sees the West African nations not as a place to be built up, but simply as a bulwark against terrorism?
Right. Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that question. And I think that the US is really the US, by the way, does know this. So it's not just me as a researcher making this observation. There are Pentagon affiliated researchers who have shown that US actions in West Africa and Africa have been counterproductive. So even within the military, there are people making this observation, right? So given that, even why does it continue? Um, I think that part of it is, that there is so much inertia in the United States around a militarized status quo. And what do I mean by that? There is, here we get to the military industrial complex in the United States. There are politicians across the political spectrum. It doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, are kind of throwing more money at the Pentagon every year than it even asks for. And the reason for that is this complex political economic system in which the military contracting companies have a lot of political power. There are more lobbyists for that industry than there are members of Congress. And we're talking, in the 500s, I think. There's a revolving door between Congress and defense contracting companies. These companies are making over half of the Pentagon's annual budget, and here we're talking more than $350 billion a year. So this is a massive industry, and there are incentives for politicians to say, oh, we have to fund the military because it creates jobs. There's all kinds of cultural supports for those kinds of statements. So how does that translate into our policy in West Africa? It means that people are unwilling to ask the big picture questions and take the critical thinking that I'm talking about to the level of action. The military is only ever making incremental changes. How can we make this foreign military assistance slightly better, slightly different, as opposed to rethinking the whole paradigm and saying, a long-term solution to the problem of terror attacks is actually, to promote development and humanitarianism and human rights, and these are the things that are going to really address the root causes of why there's this conflict in this region. But the US is unwilling to go beyond this emphasis on militarized force. And I do think that there's racism at stake as well. I mean, I think that there is, this kind of sense of it's hard to even describe the dynamics that play out. But I think that is an undercurrent of the policy decisions that get made in relation to Africa as well.
And that would stem from obviously decades, centuries of colonialism as
Right,
well. And a
right.
question I will also ask you in terms of the Biden administration, he's put a lot of political capital in making the argument about democracy versus autocracy. But the United States, even though they have suspended aid for the time being, they're not
Yeah.
going to terminate it because they need Niger to be a central part of their strategy. But can the Biden administration maintain credibility by supporting an autocratic government that they've spent so much time talking against, particularly when it comes to obviously places like Ukraine and the like. So, how does the Biden
Right.
administration deal with this?
Yeah, so far they're refusing to call the military takeover a coup. It sounds like semantics, like that wouldn't be important, but it's absolutely the key thing upon which the whole system of assistance rests. So if the Biden administration calls what happened in Niger officially a coup, then all military and economic assistance stops at that point. By US law, the US is not allowed to do that. So, certainly the U.S. finds ways around that. We're seeing in Burkina Faso, the Biden administration starting to talk about supporting militarily again what the regime in Burkina Faso in order to fight this conflict. So it's not the first time that I think there was precedence under the Obama administration as well to kind of fail to call what happened in a country a coup in order to continue a certain type of assistance. So that might happen again. It certainly, undermines the credibility of the United States, I think, in the eyes of the world. And things have been heading in that direction for a long time with the war on terror, and all of the kind of torture and black sites and CIA covert CIA operations and drone strikes and all that. I mean, there's been a growing awareness, I think, in other parts of the world of the kind of hypocritical nature in which the US is talking about promoting democracy on the one hand, and then its actions really run counter to that.
One of the things that has come out of this crisis is that the Economic Community of West African States has threatened military intervention into Niger if President Bazoum is not returned to power. But part of that makeup includes that Burkina Faso and Mali have said that if they intervene militarily, they will consider that an act of war against them as well.
Yeah.
So, number one, do you think this organization will engage in military intervention? And if that occurs, what do you think the long term implications of that will be?
Oh, it's just horrible to contemplate, isn't it? Just you can just envision an outbreak of another regional war, that would take years to end, and just the devastation that would wreak. So this ECOWAS has set a deadline. It set a deadline of Sunday
Mhm.
by which the junta had to restore President Bazoum to power. And in response, the junta is doubling down. They closed their airspace on Sunday, no flights above Niger. So they are really digging their heels in, and so far ECOWAS has failed to materialize its threat. The flip side is this argument some people are making in which they're saying if ECOWAS fails to act, then we're gonna what's stopping all the other countries in the region from having coups as well. So either way, it doesn't bode well for this region, unfortunately. And I think one thing that we often fail to remember when we're talking about foreign policy is that this is real people this affects, that these are people who are struggling to, in a lot of cases get enough to eat. I met a group of people in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a few years ago that had been displaced by terror attacks. They were living in an abandoned school building, and depending on the charity of surrounding villagers who themselves struggle with food insecurity, to eat one time a day, rice or millet, a plain meal. And the kids were suffering from malaria. I heard of one child who had just died because he had malaria on top of anemia. And it's just so the human suffering that is resulting from this conflict is just enormous. Millions of people are displaced. Thousands have been killed. It's really devastating already. Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, it's one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world today that doesn't get talked about enough. So I always try to kind of remember to ground my analysis in that lived experience there.
Now, as you raised that, one of the things that was interesting to me when General Chani was talking about why the coup occurred, and he did talk about security, and that is obviously a major problem. But there was very little discussion about the things that you just talked about, the humanitarian need, uh,
Right.
the issue of poverty, the issue of gender inequality. Um, there was very little talk about that. So it can make one wonder that while a lot of these things are true in terms of the United States, taking advantage of Niger, that what is really at the heart in his mind for why he led this coup? Is it just really the security issue?
You know, it can't be because Niger is actually doing so much better than its neighbors, Burkina Faso and Mali, in terms of the security situation. The insecurity and the terror attacks were really confined to the border regions of Niger, and not affecting the Niamey, the capital, or the large majority of the country. Agadez, either where I went, I visited as well because the U.S. has an air base there. It's really just, to me, it sounded like an empty excuse or justification for a power grab, really. And people have written that, analysts have written that as well, as like, who benefits from these coups? Certainly not the people of the countries where the coups happen. We're not seeing Burkina Faso or Mali, the citizens there, benefiting from the coups, because the insecurity has only gotten worse. The repression, government violence has gotten worse. So it's really the coup leaders themselves, who are the ones who are benefiting from their power grabs.
Now, you had mentioned ECOWAS and what they're going to do. Now, they're going to be meeting again on Thursday to decide whether or not they're going to intervene or create another deadline or whatever the case may be. But the question is, ECOWAS, in terms of its military intervention, that idea is being led primarily by the president of Nigeria, who has this long border with Niger. But his Senate has pretty much prohibited him from going ahead and making soldiers available. So the question I would have, if they do not intervene militarily after all of this bluster, what
Right.
does that say about that region? And as you just mentioned, does that make it now kind of open season for juntas to take over many more nations within the Sahel region?
I do fear that people are talking about that as a possible outcome if Nigeria doesn't act. So people are saying that they really need to kind of put some action behind the threat, the bluster, as you say, if there aren't to be other coups, because nothing would stop that from happening otherwise in other regions, in other countries. So it is quite worrisome either way, because
Mhm.
if they invade, it's also quite worrisome. Yeah.
Now, the United States Undersecretary of State did visit Niger. She didn't meet with General Chani, but she met with one of his underlings and what she deemed as a very difficult meeting. Uh, does the United States have any leverage in this situation?
you One would think that the US would. um, that's one of the puzzling things about what's going on, because Blinken had just promised another 130 million in US assistance to Niger when he was there in March. No other foreign government was, again, funding Niger at the same scale. And I've spoken with, African military leaders about this, and they say, every foreign power offered something different, and what really stood out of what the U.S. offers is the scale of the assistance. It's massive. Small for the Pentagon, because we're talking the Pentagon has, $800 billion annual budget a year, so it's able to channel millions to a country like this, and it's just a drop, pennies, or drop in the bucket. But for these countries, it's a big deal. So anyway, what's puzzling is that Niger is not acting as though this does give the US much leverage. Like, they are signaling that, by Chiani refusing to meet Victoria Nuland, and by the kind of difficult nature, it seems, of that negotiation conversation, it seems like they're not really willing to concede very much at all to the threat of the US pulling its hundreds of millions in assistance. And so I think they're seeing that, in Burkina Faso and Mali, they're able to kind of continue without it, and it's honestly, it's hard to know what's going on in that regard.
So if the United States, let's say, pulls out and they leave a void, and I know you said previously that for right now, people like the Wagner Group is a minor player and or minor inconvenience, quite frankly, at this stage of the game. But if the United States pulls out, who does that open the door for? Is it Russia? Is it China? I mean, who would benefit the most if the United States just leaves Niger alone?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a, a strong possibility that the Nigerian regime would invite the Wagner Group. What they are doing essentially in Mali is providing support to keep the regime in power. Like, that's the main thing that they're doing. And there were rumors of that being happening in Burkina Faso, although nothing confirmed so far. But there again, this is kind of the rumor mill that of what might happen in Niger, but it's not the same scale. Again, of what the US was doing. And, I think it is a mistake that a kind of a sensationalism that's happening in the US media right now. All of the headlines, I think that's one of the reasons why the Niger coup has made so much news, is because it's kind of this new Cold War scenario that the media is saying, well, if this will open the door to these Russia kind of taking over as the main ally in these areas. It's so complicated because it's certainly, and we're seeing the Russian flags at the rallies that are supporting the coup leaders, right? But part of that is really about this anti-colonial sentiment and this popular feeling that, people hate France so much that, Russia is the alternative power that they can ask, for support, because they see France, US, what the West as allied with France. Um, but again, it's hard to imagine the government. I think that really overlooks the fact that these governments in this region have their own agency, that they have their own decision making powers and their own reasons for doing things, and they're using each strategic allyship for what they can get from it. And it's not as though they're going to completely buy into, Russian, somehow be a complete political alignment with Russia just because they're non-alignment with the West. So I think it's a mistake to kind of portray this as this new Cold War situation. And certainly, Russia is much weaker militarily, at least, than anyone would have thought, and we've seen that play out in Ukraine. China has been effective in the past years in kind of buying a lot of political alignment through big infrastructure projects in Africa, roads and electricity and different kinds of things. But again, it's apples to oranges because they're not really they might be selling these countries some weapons. But when I was there, people were quick to joke about kind of shoddy weapons from China, the bulletproof vests that don't really protect you from bullets and that kind of thing. So, again, I think that it's misleading to portray this as like an either or scenario. It's much more complex than that. And we have to remember that these local governments are the ones in charge and they're the ones that are making the decisions. And you can't really buy their support so easily.
Let me ask you to put your prediction hat on for a moment. You've done a lot of work in this area. You've spoken with military leaders and leaders of other sectors within these countries. Where do you think this is going to end? Do you think President Bazoum will be restored to power? Do you think there will be intervention? And what do you think this will do ultimately to a global balance of power if this is not resolved or if it is resolved?
Oh my goodness. I wish I knew any of the answers to those questions. What I can say is that it's looking like the military takeover is for real, and that President Bazoum is not going to be reinstated. If I could take a guess, it's certainly signs are pointing in that direction. Um, will there be an invasion? I really don't know at this point. Again, they missed their deadline. And there's the threat of retaliation from Burkina Faso and Mali if Ecowas were to invade. So that's a kind of a stalemate right now. So it's really hard to know what's going to happen. Global balance of power. Um, the US and the West saw Niger as the kind of last standing bulwark against the complete fall of this region into chaos and instability. With Niger being ruled by a military regime, I don't anticipate that will resolve the problem of insecurity and militant terror attacks. It's only gotten worse, as I explained, in neighboring Burkina Faso and Mali. So I don't think that's going to resolve. So I don't see a lot of reason for hope on the horizon. Unfortunately, I feel really sad for the people of Niger and the Sahel. I hope that these governments are able to use different kinds of tactics in the end to resolve this. Again, some interesting historical research has shown that governments are most effective at dealing with the problem of terror attacks when they address the root causes of the grievances of these militants and eventually incorporate them as legitimate political actors into the legitimate political sphere. So is there a possible scenario in which these governments can, start doing negotiations and disarmament and demobilization in the long term? Oh, I hope, but the prospect doesn't look great for that.
And you would not see at this stage of the game military intervention from the United States and or France, particularly with the fact that they're now preoccupied with Ukraine. So you would not see that as a possibility, or would you?
No, I doubt that would happen. Yeah, the region is probably they're just. I don't think that the U.S. and France would count on enough political support for that kind of an action. There just would it wouldn't be there. So I don't see that happening necessarily.
So my last question to you in the minute we have left, if you were speaking to Secretary of State Blinken, how would you tell him to handle this situation?
Oh, the $1,000,000 question. It's so complex, I think I have a better understanding of the complexities and the problems than the solutions. And unfortunately, academics aren't policymakers and vice versa. But I think
But
I
you
would,
have made policy recommendations in some of
yeah,
your
and
in
I
your
think,
writings.
yeah, I think what I would urge is that again, we the US stops over militarizing the assistance to this region, and that we think about the kind of bigger picture, longer term solutions of development and human rights, and as much as possible prioritize promoting those kinds of long term solutions that involve even thinking about reparations for colonialism, right? And those kinds of big picture addressing the kind of discontent that we're seeing rise up in support of these coups.
Stephanie Savell is the senior researcher for the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and the co-director of the Cost of War Project. And she has been my guest today on the Aguilar Conversation, and I want to thank her for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And join us again next week as we have another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.